Good day. I'm Brenda Brown, the social work manager at Holyoke Hospital and a member of the Partnership Coalition of Holyoke. In conjunction with Governor Wells' declaration that the week of June 7th, 1993 be recognized as violence prevention, we are here today to discuss issues of violence in our society, particularly in the area of domestic relationships and sexual assault. Our panel today will consist of, first to my left, Eileen Casella, who is the community educator for Womanshelter Compañeras in Holyoke. Next to her is Garry Bombardier, emergency room physician at Holyoke Hospital and also chairperson of their domestic violence task force. Next to him is Jane Deshais, patrol officer and member of the rape squad of Holyoke Police Force. Before we begin, there are some facts that I think we should be aware of. 4 women each day are beaten to death by their male partners, and that's nationwide. More than half of all homeless women are on the street because they are fleeing domestic violence. Children who grow up in violent homes have a 74% higher likelihood of committing assault. 1 woman in 3 will be raped in her lifetime. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 7 boys will have been sexually assaulted by age 18. And 27% of girls aged 15 to 19 have been victims of rape or attempted rape. 84% of them knew their attackers. These are statistics, the last 4 were statistics from 1983. I've asked the panel to present a brief summary of these issues. There will be specific questions following later and a discussion. Eileen, can you begin with the history and role of Womanshelter Compañeras?
Sure. Thank you, Brenda. Womanshelter Compañeras is a battered women's shelter that services women and children in the greater Holyoke-Chicopee area. We've been in existence since 1980. All services are provided free and confidential to women. We provide a 24-hour hotline as well as emergency shelter. We also have individual and group support for women. We do a teen dating violence presentation for children in schools as well as community education. Okay, thank you.
Garry, can you give us some information about your perspective of violence and your role in the domestic team here?
About a year and a half ago, I changed my practice from internal medicine that I'd been in for about 12 years and entered into the emergency department at Holyoke Hospital. There were a lot of different things that I had to learn, but one of the things that I saw that was very striking and that it was repeated over and over was a high incidence of violence against women and against children. And it was frightening, and it was a shocking experience for me. The more I looked into it, the more that I found that people in general in the healthcare professions had very little idea of what to do and how to handle these problems. A lot of times people even try to hide the existence of the problem simply because they were so shocking and they were so difficult to deal with. I looked at this as a goal of mine, and the goal was to try to develop a way of helping the hospital and the personnel and the people that I dealt with, and hopefully the community in general, to recognize and to help take care of the people who are really the victims of this terrible problem. So because of that, feeling. And because of that goal, I've helped set up the task force at Holyoke Hospital and helped to try to coordinate our efforts with some of the other services in the community, Womanshelter being one of them, so that we could create a more coordinated approach and to help educate people. And so basically that's where I've started and why I've come to this point today.
Okay, thank you, Garry. Jane, I would like to see if you could give me some idea of your role of in the community and what violence seems to be pervasive here and why.
Well, Brenda, in the city of Holyoke, excuse me, we have seen an increase in violence in our school system. And as a result, we now have officers assigned to not all the schools, but some of the schools in the city every day, every school day. Violence, of course, is something that we deal with all the time. And it's the name of the game, shall we say. We have seen, as regards domestic violence, we have seen, and I couldn't give you real statistics at this point, but we have seen a tremendous increase in the Abuse Prevention Act, the use of it, what we call 209As, okay? And as you probably already know, the criminal justice system came forward, and we now have a statute whereby a 209A can be issued on an emergency basis. You do not have to anymore, as you used to, go to the courthouse, fill out the affidavit, and appear in front of the judge. We can, at the station, to give out a 209A, we contact the judge on the phone. We now have judges that are on call over the weekend. So that's, you know, we have, and that's increased tremendously. So yes, we're trying to deal with it as best we can.
Okay. All right, I think I'll get back to you with some other questions, especially about the rape unit. Okay. Eileen, I think one of the first questions I would like is to find out, it's been an issue that people always bring up, why do women stay in a relationship that is abusive, and then after they leave, they sometimes go back? Could you kind of go over that with me?
Sure. I think that one of the main reasons why women stay is an incredible fear. A significant amount of women that are killed will be killed either in the process of leaving or right after they've left their abuser. That's pretty scary.
Yes.
And there's a lot of other reasons that play into it. Economically, women can't afford to be on their own without the financial support from the man, the abuser. There's a great fear that the abuser will try to gain custody of the children or somehow take them away from her. You know, and also they just feel like they should stay together for the children's sake. Religious reasons sort of factor into that too. There's many reasons why women stay, and more often than not, they want the abuse to end. They don't want the relationship to end necessarily. They want the abuse to end.
So the caring and the loving are still there, but it's just that the person has changed from what they had initially were involved in the relationship.
Yeah, and frequently the abuser might not show his abusive side until years after they've been together. You know, so there's that established sort of secure home for a woman, and all of a sudden, or maybe not even all of a sudden, but just eventually it kind of breaks down, and he begins to control her, and it's a gradual process.
So that's something on what I've heard is the cycle of violence?
Right. Lenore Walker created a theory around the cycle of violence. Is what she calls the beginning is the tension building stage, where there's tension in the relationship, there's stress. Then after that, there's an explosive incident where the abuse happens, and then following the explosive incident, there's a honeymoon phase where he'll profusely apologize to her. He'll buy her things and he'll apologize, and then she'll believe him that he won't do that again. But more frequently than not, it will just kind of create over and over again. And sometimes the honeymoon phase is cut out altogether, and it's just, I mean, he's gotten so used to the fact that she's just going to stay he can control her so that phase might be cut out altogether.
So it's really a control situation
Yeah.
in a battering situation
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Okay. Could you probably expand a little bit on how do you handle a victim who, I know that we have safe areas here in Holyoke and other places do the same thing, but suppose a victim is really afraid about being maintained in the same community.
Right, right.
How does the Women's Shelter help with someone like
Well,
that?
Women's Shelter is in a highly confidential location in the city of Holyoke. In cases where a woman feels that she's going to be threatened, if she has a car, for example, and she thinks he's going to see the car, or if she happens to live in that neighborhood and she's afraid she may run into him, and this may happen, Women's Shelter will work very, very closely with this woman to get her into a safe community, whether that's in Massachusetts, in another shelter, or outside of Massachusetts. But we will work with a woman to get her in a safe location.
So even outside of the state,
Yeah.
there is connection with other shelters and programs across
Right,
the
right.
nation.
Mhm.
That's a really important thing that I think people should be aware of. Can you kind of go over some preventive type of things that if a woman is in a battering situation, what
Sure.
she should be doing?
Okay. One of the things that I can think of that a woman, if she's in a battering relationship, I think to be in touch with Women's Shelter, call the 24-hour hotline, set up, even if you call the shelter, you don't have to come in. You can get some support over the phone. If a woman feels like she's going to be leaving the abusive relationship, for her to pack a bag, get some money, and get if there's children involved, get their records that are important for her to get out of the house,
Okay.
and have an emergency plan really in action. Maybe to be in touch with the police, let them know, work on getting a 209A, and if there's threat of him harming her, then really to get out and get into a safe and confidential location as soon as possible. But certainly to be in touch with Battered Women's Shelter at any stage of the relationship where she feels like maybe she's not ready to leave yet, she can always call and get some support over the phone, and maybe easier to call the second and the third time and to establish that kind of relationship.
Okay. And I gather that the Women's Shelter will help support them through the process if it becomes an issue of going to court and things like
Oh,
that.
absolutely.
And-
We are in the process of developing a program, a legal advocacy program, the LEAP program. And but in addition to the LEAP program, we do have volunteers and advocates who are trained to go into the courts with women who are applying for 209As and other things that might come along, as far as the court procedures that need to happen around the getting out of the relationship.
Okay. One question I just wanted to ask. Children are included in this. It's not just the woman, so that if you have children, the shelter does house them. I just think you should just kind of perhaps let us know that it's
Well,
not just...
The shelter itself houses up to 24 women and children. And
Okay.
every room in the shelter has a crib and many bunk beds for the kids. So there's a lot of facilities for children.
What happens with their education? If, is there tutoring that goes on, or...
There's a woman in the shelter who works as a child advocate, and she does a lot of play therapy with them. And I guess in ages when children are going to school, if they could continue going to school, that would be the best situation if there's not a threat of them being abducted by their abuser or any kind of threat at all. So we would hope that they would remain in school in their community.
So the best plan, really, if someone is really planning to leave, is to really have a plan in action, a safety plan that they can fall back on,
Right.
and not just to leave and not have all of this available, and I guess some money aside
Right,
too, which
right.
would be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you,
You're welcome.
Eileen. Dr. Bombardier, I wanted to start asking you some questions, and you mentioned about the medical profession and that there's an issue that you as a physician are more involved. Are there others in your profession who are becoming more involved with the violence that's in our environment? If you could kind of talk about that for us.
Well, it's been a pretty clear fact that from ancient times until present times, violence in the domestic setting has been an issue, and the problem is it hasn't always been recognized. Some people have done research on mummified remains from 3,000 years ago and have found evidence in women, mummies that they had examined of broken skulls and broken bones at a rate of about 30%. And when they compare that to the male counterparts, mummified remains, they found a rate between 5 and 15% of broken bones. Some people feel that because of the time period not being one in which war was present, that this is a reflection of probably a violent relationship between males and females even back at that time. Our society and previous societies have looked at domestic relations as something that occurred within the castle, within that protected area that wasn't the realm of medicine, wasn't the realm of lawyers, wasn't the realm of police. For a very long time, the laws were written to protect actually the activities inside of the house and to encourage people not to interfere and not to look at what went on. Violence surely went on, and is fairly well documented, but wasn't looked at as a specific problem. Even at the turn of the century here in the United States, laws were just beginning to be written that protected women from being beaten by their husbands as a normal routine. We were talking about a normal thing, to be able to hit one's wife with a stick no bigger than the size of your thumb, and that was actually written into the law, and those laws in the latter part of the 1800s started to disappear. Even after that, we found that abuse of children wasn't recognized by the medical profession. There were articles that were written where well-known physicians tried to find syndromes that would explain multiple broken bones and multiple injuries in children and not understand where that was coming from. And it really wasn't until the mid-60s that battered child syndrome was described, and it kind of opened the eyes of people to the idea that, my goodness, something's been going on here. We've been trying to figure out what it is, but we just never thought that this problem was such a big problem or such a severe difficulty. So the medical profession was slow to come around. Both society made it so it didn't want to look at it, and we didn't want to believe that people were getting hurt as much as they were getting hurt. So what we saw was a slow realization. In 1985, the Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. Koop, came out and described domestic violence as a national emergency, a public health emergency. He looked at the statistics along with the other people who had those statistics at hand and noted that this was not just a big problem, but what seemed to be an increasing problem. And talked about it in terms of something that we had to approach both as cause, as a treatment for the cause, and as a protection for the people who were being abused. So that really kicked off around 1985. Still, even at that, the medical profession was kind of slow at picking up the stick and running with it here. And so it wasn't really until this year in Massachusetts that the Mass Medical Society, under Dr. Callahan's term as president of the Medical Society, picked up domestic violence as a problem that we had to recognize and had to try to get a handle on. And so basically, what we're looking at is a very short history of recognizing this as a problem and recognizing it as a factor that we would want to intervene in, that society would allow us to do that. Medical profession, I think, is very young in its accumulation of knowledge. It hasn't been going on for a long time, and we're really just beginning now to be able to recognize the people who are at risk and to be able to recognize the system that's been set up that we can send these people to who have been battered so that they can get safety, and trying to figure out a way of trying to diminish the amount of violence that we have in our society in general, so make this as a less acceptable way of handling domestic disputes and arguments and handling domestic relations between men and women or men and children or the families in general.
Okay. So I guess what we're looking at is that the physicians are becoming more attuned. Does that include also other health professionals and hospitals? Is there a joint working relationship in that there is a purpose? What is the emergency room or ambulatory centers interested in what's happening? And can you give us some idea of what you're doing in the emergency room?
Well, in general, first of all, through the Medical Society, I've been to Boston and to several conferences and studies in looking at domestic violence in general, trying to define a method of handling this problem. And the Medical Society here in Massachusetts has been a leader in developing a set of guidelines for trying to diagnose the problem, for increasing your awareness of the possible diagnosis of battering and domestic violence when dealing with especially women who are injured, children who are injured, and opening the eyes of physicians in general. Part of my role here in Western Massachusetts has been on several occasions to go out and give lectures using the information through the Medical Society that I've had, plus other information that I've gathered on my own, to try to begin to increase the awareness of physicians. At all of the lectures, the other healthcare providers have been included, and we would talk about nurse practitioners and nurse midwives and social workers and ward clerks and guards in the emergency department, and anyone who might be in contact with a patient who might be able to pick up the fact that this person is in for a reason different than the sprained ankle or the chronic headache. And a lot of times the patients who are there will relate to a person and not other people, and so what we found that we need to educate everyone to the danger of the violence and to the scope of the problem. And as we do that, I think that we're going to get a hold of the violence a little bit more, at least as far as protecting the people who are injured. Our emergency department has begun an education program, which is through the entire hospital eventually, but right now in the emergency department, where we are giving a basic set of information and a basic description of the people who are at risk and a rather detailed description of how to handle the problems, how to handle the people in a way that they'll feel as important human beings that they are, in spite of the fact that they've been battered and hurt, and to be able to try to guide them to their safety. So it's important on the emergency room setting, it's important, but in addition to that, it's important in the hospital scope, because these people can be recognized at many different levels, and a lot of times you'd be surprised when that battered person will come out and say, you know, this has happened because my husband has hurt me, and it isn't always the emergency room doctor or the nurse at a triage station in the emergency room. It might be the cleaning woman who is in housekeeping and is washing the room, who happens to interact in that meaningful way with that woman. And everyone who is involved needs to know, yes, this is a real problem, and this is what we do when we run into it. And I think that that's part of the education that we're trying to accomplish in the hospital. We're going to try to, in addition to that, try to hook ourselves up with the Womanshelter and reach out into the community to give people an idea of what violence is, what they might be living, the terrible life they might be living that they may think is normal, that they may think is something that everybody goes through because they've been so isolated, and to be able to open the eyes of some of the women and maybe some of their neighbors to say, well, gee, Mrs. Jones has that problem, and now I know a place I can send them or a telephone number I can give them. So I think that we're going to try with our committee, once we establish the program in the hospital, to try to outreach into the community as well. It's a huge part of our plan. We don't want to just educate medical people. First, that's where we're aiming, but the real goal is to educate people.
Okay, good. That's something that's really important. And in fact, when you talk about the community, with the violence that's going on, I was wondering how we raise our children and how that's impact and all the violence that's going on, how does that impact our raising of our children and our teenagers? I know that seems to be an issue we keep seeing about, Jana talked about the schools and how that's coming up, our TVs, our movies. I think most recently was the Jurassic Park, and the fact that there's so much violence there and it's a conflict there about is it too violent for younger kids or not, yet dinosaurs are the big thing nowadays for children. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think that most people will agree what our children experience and see can have a serious effect on what they grow into as they grow older. On television, for instance, and in the movies combined, a young child before he or she is out of teenage years will see about 16,000 murders and serious violent acts on television. A lot of times those murders and violent acts are divorced from the serious effects they have on human beings. You see the actor next week; he's in a different movie. You see the people. Cars get blown up and they walk out unscathed. We see people who are shot and murdered as part of a wonderful mystery story with kindly old women trying to solve the problem. And we don't see the women cry and the men grieve and the children without their parents. And so a lot of what we see in violence on television is a huge volume and no consequence. And it's a huge volume of violence that children are exposed to. In addition, domestic violence is a problem which is widespread in our country. It's estimated that 10 million children yearly watch their mothers and fathers beat each other. A huge number.
Yes.
In addition to that, in a study that was done on college students, in a relatively affluent college, there was a number of 50% of the children said that they were assaulted by their mother or father while they lived at home. So our children see it on television, they feel it by being beaten themselves, and they see it at home in huge numbers. So we're talking about a problem that has a scope which is enormous. What happens when children are exposed to violence? And I think that when we see them, children who are exposed to violence, the first thing they do is lose a mother or father. They're either martyred or people move out of their homes. They're abandoned. And that can affect them throughout their whole life, the abandonment. Second thing that happens is physical injury. They're hurt. They may be killed. They may spend time in the hospital. They develop psychological patterns, not unlike the stress syndromes that we saw in soldiers coming home from wars because of this constant exposure. And they can develop psychiatric symptoms because of that. And a very important thing that happens is they learn violence as a way of managing normal activities in their life. They learn a violent response to handle the problems. When we see violence, the children exposed to it, we see an increase in the aggressiveness, especially in teenage boys who've been exposed to this, and an increase in the aggressive acts. There's evidence that the amount of violence a child's exposed to at 8 years old correlates directly with the amount of violent acts they perpetrate when they're 30 in young men. And so we can see a huge increase in the amount of violence as children get older. The other thing we see is, especially in women who are exposed to violence, who are victims of violence as young children, they show a large amount of depression. And they can show other psychiatric illnesses, but more in women than in young boys. The incidence of drug and alcohol abuse is higher, and as the children grow older, the incidence of child abuse of their own children and of spouse abuse is also higher in the people who are exposed to violence. And so we have a set of very unacceptable things that happen to children who've been exposed to violence, and they're exposed to violence all the time. So I think that what our children see and feel on television and in the home has a great deal to do with what we're looking at as far as the increased risk of violence and the increased amount of violence we're seeing in our society.
And as you said before, how they handle stress and learning to handle it in a violent way rather than a rational or discussion setting. You handle it by striking out or hurting someone in order to protect yourself, and actually it's not, you're offending someone else, and people don't know the difference, and it's becoming blurred. The lines appear to be blurred.
I think the other thing that we see that's a little more hopeful, it's a very dim view, is that in some of the programs that have been done in some big cities, and a program here that's made national news in Springfield, is that there is a way of teaching children who have been exposed to violence as they were young, nonviolent ways of handling their problems. And it takes an effort, I think for the most part. In this area, it's almost been a volunteer effort. The schools and the government really hasn't put any money behind it. But when we look at the results, we see a dramatic decrease in the number of violent acts in children who have been specifically taught nonviolent interaction in order to manage their problems. But it takes an effort. I think that the community has got to first be more than shocked into inactivity, which is, I think, where we are at some point. We're so frightened by this violence and so frightened by the level of violence and the terrible things that happen to people that a lot of people kind of pull back and try to say it won't happen. It won't happen. And it's going to happen unless we do something. And there are things like programs in junior high schools and high schools, and probably even younger than that, but the studies that I had looked at were in the teenage children, where actually teaching those children nonviolent ways of handling their problems had a positive effect on the way they handle problems and the incidence of violent activity. So I think that there is something that can be approached. There are programs that are very small in scope right now that probably need to become wide in scope. If we're going to change the way society acts towards violence, we have to start somewhere. We probably have to start with children.
Okay, thank you. It's very informative, and you gave us some preventive things that we should start to be looking into, and I'm sure that the task force is working on that too. Jane.
Yes,
what I thought we would start out with is, I understand that the Holyoke Police Department has developed a special unit for treating rape victims, and I was wondering if you could kind of like go over that and give me some idea of what the staff has to do as far as training to deal with victims of rape.
Sure. There are approximately a dozen of us excuse me, that are on the rape squad. And not every officer is trained. It's basically done on a volunteer basis. Those of us that would like to be rape trained, the department will send us to school. It's a week's training on how to investigate rapes. And the reason why this is done is because it's first of all, rape is, as we all know, what we call a victim crime. If you don't have a victim, you don't have the crime.
Right.
And it's a very, very sensitive crime. It's the victim at the point in time when you have to come in contact with that victim. That victim is so traumatized, and you have to do the terrible task of bringing that whole scenario that just happened to that person back to life again. Because I think human nature is that when something terrible happens to you, we try to repress it. If I forget about it, then it's not going to hurt me anymore. And we come in and we have to start this whole scenario, as I said, all over again. And it's very, very terrifying. It's like going through it all over again for the victim. So you have to be very, very sensitive. And of course, our victims, female, male, and children. And the children are particularly traumatized, obviously. And so it takes You have to be able to go into and sit down with that victim. You have to be able to gain the victim's confidence. And you have to be able to get as much information from that victim as you possibly can, as quickly as you can. So you have all these, these things to do in a short period of time, because the longer you wait to get this information, the less the chance is of apprehension. So it takes that's why we have to be trained on how to do it.
Okay. I guess Holyoke found that there was a need because of the incidents, and I gather that other towns also are having a rape program. I know it hadn't been really advertised, and I know I brought it up a couple of weeks ago at a meeting, and people didn't realize that there were a number of trained professionals, police, who are involved in it. So it's a really important thing that I think the Holyoke community really needs to be aware of, that the police force has been trained and are dealing with the issues on a sensitive and a special setting. And I think it happens at the hospital. I think you do show up at the hospital quite
Yes,
a bit.
we usually start, it usually starts at the hospital. What usually happens is that the call will come into the police department, and uniformed officers will be sent to the call. At that point in time, unless it's extremely aggravated, and what I mean by that is then there's been,
I was going to ask you what aggravated,
okay.
right?
What I mean by that is that, okay, additional violence. Okay, the woman, unfortunately, or the victim, I should say, has been cut up or whatever, got, at the risk of sounding very crude, and rushed off to the hospital. Or if there is some other reason why the victim should remain in the location where it happened, we usually respond to the hospital. And of course, it always never fails that it's, you're sound asleep in bed and the phone rings and, oh, okay, we got to respond, and we go up to the hospital. And also, before I go on, I want to make it clear that we have both male and female investigators. So whichever the victim is more comfortable talking to, sometimes it's easier for little kids, be they male or female, to talk to a female as opposed to a male. And if the victim is an older boy, maybe they want to talk to a male. Or sometimes females want to talk to males too. There's a lot of possibilities. But we respond to the hospital, and usually at that time have a conversation with the first responding officers to the scene to basically get a story of what happened, what the victim said to them, what they saw at the scene, etc., and so forth. And then in between the medical staff trying to get their stuff done, etc., and so forth, we sit down, talk to the victim, try and gain their confidence, explain to them that this is a horrible deal that they've been through. We don't mean to make them go through it again, but we have to. And we start questioning.
Jane, I have one other question to ask, and in your role as a police officer, I think it might be important for the audience to hear this, and some of our panel also. What prevention skills would you recommend to people in the situation, in a violent situation? I know there's a lot of things that police do remind you to do. In fact, I have attached, I went and got my license for my mace and things like that. But I was wondering if you could perhaps go over some of the protective things for men and women just to be aware of in this society now.
Right, Brenda, I think one of the things that is prevalent in our society is that we tend to think that women are the only victims of violence. And that is definitely not the case. Men and women and children, as we well know, are victims of violence. So therefore, any of these preventive methods can be used either or. For example, walking down the street, particularly if you are in an unknown area, an area that you're not familiar with, a city that you may be visiting or whatever. When you walk down the street, you always walk not near the curb or the street and not near the building, center of the sidewalk. You always walk like you have a purpose in mind. When you're going shopping and you go drive into the parking lot, look around, see what's around you. Is there anybody just sitting in a car? And if there is, make a mental note of it. When you come back to your car, and we're all guilty of this, particularly at Christmas time, holiday time, we come back to the car.
Yes.
All right, you haven't got enough hands, all right? First thing you should do is you should never come out loaded. If necessary, make arrangements to get to for a store, to many times like at the information desk and so forth, or different wrapping booths. They will hold your packages for you. Bring them down to the car, put them in the trunk, obviously.
Yeah.
All right. Do not leave things hanging around in plain view in your vehicle. When you come back to your vehicle, have the keys for your vehicle in your hand. Have the key that unlocks the door between your index and middle fingers. The key for the ignition between the middle and the ring fingers. And have it in your strong hand, not your weak hand. Ladies, when you walk down the street and you're carrying your purse should be to the front of you like this. It should be at all times zipped. Gentlemen, when you're in a strange area, take the wallets out of the back pockets. Not a good idea. Find other places to put your identification and your money. Pickpockets are at their best, particularly in tourist areas. And we are at that time of the year when we're going into tourist time.
Okay. Thank you, Jane. That's some
My
things I
pleasure.
think all the audience is definitely interested in hearing about. Dr. Bombardier, was one question I just wanted to kind of go over, and I forgot, and I didn't ask you about some preventive type of things that people should be aware of, but perhaps one of the things you can briefly discuss is when we're raising our children and how we perceive boys and girls, and how we kind of like train them to be a certain characteristics, and that sometimes can, especially in a dating type of thing, relationship with children, how they perceive each one. And I thought you might be able to go over that a little bit.
Well, I think that one thing that we see is that there's a process of socialization that we have in the United States in which we have certain stereotypes that as parents and as people in the society, we look towards men as having certain characteristics and women as having other characteristics. And I think that that because we have these stereotype views, we set our young women up for falling into problems with their relationships with young men. I think that for the most part, men are taught by their parents and by society in general to be striving for power, to be in control of their lives and their situations, to be tough, to be unemotional, and to make rapid and aggressive decisions. And in many cases, if not most, in many cases, our young men are brought up in that regard. In women, they are socialized in a way by society to be more gentle, more emotional, more caring, more family-oriented, and also given the role of gatekeeper as far as sexual practices and sexual activities. And it kind of exonerates men from having to make any decisions about whether or not to have sex. Well, if the girl lets me do it, it's okay. And if she doesn't let me do it, it isn't all right. So the young women are more or less put in a situation where they are being forced to be the people to try to make those decisions. Young men, society often doesn't have them try to make that decisions, but they can get is all right. I think that often in dating, young women look at life differently. Young men, and there are a lot of studies and a lot of people have looked into this and look at college-age men and college-age women as looking at life differently. Men are goal-oriented. They often will look at things that women do as being sexually stimulating or as being something that's inviting them to go further. Activities such as driving in the car with a male, things like having her bills paid by him and picked up by him, if she accepts an invitation to go back to his room after the date. These are things that are shown as open invitations to go ahead and have sexual relations or sexual interactions with her. Very often the young women, because of their socializing, will assume that they're still in control, assume that that they really aren't looking at that as an invitation. And so we have people who are going into a situation with totally different views of what's about to happen. I think that it's important as parents to teach our children of these occasions, teach our children of the idea that men and women look at activities, at short dresses, at fashionable fashions. They look at them differently. Women often will look at clothing as being pretty and fashionable. Men will look at them as being stimulating. And so I think it's important for us to teach children that and to let them know that if you have a young woman, to let her know, pay her way, drive her car. Right. Make sure that if she's invited to someone's apartment or house, that she knows that that could be a situation that could get out of control for her quickly. She might want to avoid it completely. And that is just an idea that perhaps we can do it in teaching our children, teaching our parents.
Thank you, Garry. I think the audience is very interested in hearing that, and these are things that I hadn't even thought about. And I think women thinking of themselves, when you said about dressing attractively, I think that's what we look for. We look to see how we can make ourselves more attractive, but in a positive light, and not to say we're open invitation for sexual involvement. It's just the way we feel about ourselves, and we like people to say, yes, you do look nice, because it makes us feel better, but at the same time we're not saying, hey, you know, this is an open area. I want to just kind of ask a general question. If you can tell us how you think the community, and anyone can answer, could be more involved in dealing with domestic violence. I mean, there's a lot of things we went on individually, but do you see the Holyoke community ready at this point to become more involved, and what are some of the things that they might consider doing to help become more involved and help to deal with violence in our community?
Well, I think one thing that they could do, unfortunately today, people don't really know their neighbors. People tend to keep more to themselves than, particularly in multifamily dwellings, they tend to keep more to themselves than people did, say, 30 years ago. You don't need to know your neighbor's name or name of the kids or whatever, but it's a good idea to at least know their last name. And if you hear anything that to you is out of place, screaming, yelling, objects hitting walls, don't say, if I ignore it, it'll go away. Pick up the phone and call the station. And just tell them that you believe there could be a domestic disturbance. Not every call we go to is for real. Sometimes the person who called misunderstood or didn't really know, but to them that's what it sounded like. That's fine. That's fine. That's what we're there. If we can get there and prevent somebody from getting hurt, I'd much rather go for nothing than go for something, I'll tell you, anytime.
Okay, good.
Anytime.
Yeah,
I think that we have to move in a way of to get our community more involved in what's going on with violence. There's been more money allocated towards violence in Massachusetts, and a lot of that money has gone into the judiciary. I think that what we've seen with the ineffectiveness of restraining orders, that in spite of tremendous efforts by the police force and the Attorney General and the legislature actually to pass laws to stiffen penalties, in spite of all that, we're still seeing a woman beaten every 15 seconds in the United States. In spite of that, we're still seeing women killed and murdered while they try to get out of an abusive situation at home. We're seeing not much of a change in the effects of violence in our society. So we're putting money in putting people in jail, and we're putting money into enforcing our laws and writing stiffer laws, but I think that we have to put our money and our efforts also into trying to prevent the violence from occurring in the first place. And when it does occur, trying to protect the people who are the real victims of the violence. I think that our society has to look at putting funds for shelters so that instead of cutting back on their staff and cutting back on their help, which is what's going on right this minute, instead of having to do that, we can actually expand the help that's given and expand the staff that's there so that people who are being hurt can get the kind of protection that they need. I think that we have to look at programs that work, such as the interventions in a nonviolent fashion in our schools. And to see that in Duluth, that has worked, that in Springfield, and I don't know enough about the program there except what I saw on national television, that a few dedicated people have gotten together to make a program that works. That if you have something that works, then I think we have to fund it and make it part of our curriculum. We can't assume that children are being taught in their homes that violence is bad and that beating mothers and children is something that isn't acceptable. I think that we have to assume perhaps that isn't happening, and that what we have to do is fund that kind of education to prevent violence for our future generations. We need to protect the people who are being beaten and murdered now, and we have to try to figure out a way to prevent it from happening in the future. And I think only if society, if our community gets together, will that work.
Okay, thank you. Eileen, did you have something that you would like to add?
I really want to echo what Dr. Bombardier said about the education piece. I mean, that's what I was, the first thought that I had. I think it's a long-term goal. And I think to re-educate little boys in our society on alternatives to violence, and little girls on, becoming stronger and less dependent. I think that it gets into the sexual stereotypes that he sort of touched on before. And I do think it's a long-term goal.
I think also I just wanted to put in something for the women's shelter and other things, is that volunteers. I think any type of agency and program, I know volunteering has not become as an open field as it used to be, but I think it's really needed that we need community people to volunteer, and I'm sure that the women's shelter could use them. The fact that we're going to have a domestic violence task force available, the police could use people who are volunteering to help us deal with this issue, and if there are any questions or anything, that we please contact the partnership. Carlos Vega is in charge there, and we can answer some questions if they do come up. And thank you very much for listening today, and we hope that this will impact some of the things that are happening in your life. Thank you.